8 years ago, I was talked into going on a camping trip that I'll never forget. And for all the wrong reasons. I was never the outdoorsy type. My idea of a good time involved video games and takeout, not sleeping on the ground and cooking over a fire. But my roommate Chris was different. Chris was a seasoned camper, fully equipped with all the gear you could imagine. Packed into his trusty Jeep, he had a knack for finding the perfect secluded camping spots, far from the crowds of designated campsites. One Friday afternoon, Chris convinced me to join him for a weekend camping trip in the Rocky Mountains. He assured me it would be a refreshing change from our usual routines and promised a breathtaking experience. Reluctantly, I agreed. We drove into the Rockies, the sun dipping below the horizon as we ventured deeper into the wilderness. Just as the sky was painted with hues of orange and purple, Chris found a spot he deemed perfect. It was secluded, surrounded by towering trees and the distant sound of a babbling brook. We set up our tent, gathered some firewood, and began to cook hot dogs over the fire. As night settled in, the sounds of the forest came alive around us. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and for a moment, I began to understand why Chris loved camping so much. But then, just as we were about to dig into our meal, we heard it, a scream. It started as a faint cry, almost like an animal in distress. But as it grew louder, it became clear that it was a woman's scream, echoing through the trees. It was filled with such raw terror that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We both froze, staring at each other in disbelief. "Help. Please. Someone help me." The voice was closer now, desperate and filled with panic. Without saying a word, Chris sprang into action. He quickly doused the fire and started packing up our gear. My hands were trembling so much that I could barely help him. The screams continued, each one more desperate than the last, until finally there was a blood-curdling scream that was abruptly cut off, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "We need to get out of here," Chris whispered urgently. We threw our gear into the Jeep haphazardly and jumped in. Chris floored it, and we sped down the rough, narrow trail, the headlights piercing the darkness. My heart was pounding, and I fumbled for my phone. With shaky hands, I dialed 911, praying for enough signal to make the call. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was a lifeline in the chaos. I quickly explained what we had heard, my voice trembling. The operator told us to stay on the line and keep driving towards the main road, where police would meet us. We drove in tense silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel under the tires and my own ragged breathing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw the glow of the main road ahead. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Just as we reached the road, the headlights illuminated a hooded figure dragging a large, heavy bag. The figure froze, and for a brief moment, we locked eyes. Then, as if spurred by the sight of us, he dropped the bag and fled into the woods. Moments later, flashing red and blue lights appeared, and the police arrived. We pointed them in the direction the man had fled, and a couple of officers took off in pursuit. The remaining officers approached the bag cautiously. My stomach churned as they unzipped it, revealing the remains of a young woman, later identified as a 21-year-old local, who'd been reported missing earlier that week. The next few hours were a blur of questions and statements. The police thanked us for calling them and potentially stopping a dangerous individual. They took our information and assured us they would do everything to catch the man. As we drove home in silence, the weight of what we had witnessed settled over us. We never found out if the man was caught. The police kept us updated for a while, but eventually, the call stopped. Chris and I didn't talk much about that night after the initial shock wore off. We didn't need to. The memory of those screams and the sight of that bag haunted us both. That experience shattered any illusion I had about the safety of the wilderness. It's a place where anything can happen, and sometimes the monsters aren't the animals in the forest, but the people you least expect. I haven't gone camping since that night, and I doubt I ever will. The great outdoors lost its allure for me, replaced by a lingering sense of dread. Last summer, my dad and I decided to go camping for the weekend. I was 15, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies, warm days, and cool nights. We chose a familiar forest, a place we had camped numerous times before. It had a beautiful river and some of the best camping spots. The best part, we were always the only ones who ever camped there. We arrived early Saturday morning, set up our tents, gathered firewood, and spent the day fishing and hiking. It was the perfect father-son getaway. By nightfall, we were exhausted. After a hearty dinner cooked over the campfire, we crawled into our sleeping bags and quickly fell asleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to use the bathroom. Our campsite was dark, the fire reduced to embers. I glanced over at my dad's tent and noticed he was completely covered, even his face. I thought it was strange, but figured he was just trying to keep warm. Quietly, I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the woods. On my way back, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. My dad's tent was unzipped, and he was nowhere to be seen. My first thought was that he must have gotten up to use the bathroom too. I decided to wait for him by the fire, but as the minutes ticked by, worry began to gnaw at me. The first light of dawn was creeping through the trees when I finally heard something. My dad's voice coming from behind a tree near his tent said urgently, "That's not me." I froze. Slowly, I turned to see my dad emerging from behind the tree, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Pack up. We're leaving now," he said, his voice trembling. "But what about our tents and gear?" I protested. "Leave them," he insisted. "Just grab your backpack and let's go." Without another word, we stuffed our essentials into our backpacks and headed to the car, leaving everything else behind. My heart was pounding as we sped down the dirt road, away from the campsite. Once we were safely in the car, I finally asked, "What happened?" My dad took a deep breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "After you fell asleep, I realized we were low on some supplies. I didn't want to wake you, so I drove to the nearest store. It took longer than I expected. When I got back, I saw someone slipping into my tent. I stared at him in disbelief. "Someone was in your tent. What did you do?" I stayed hidden behind a tree, watching. I wanted to make sure they didn't go near you. Whoever it was, they stayed in my tent all night. I didn't dare move until I saw you get up and go to the bathroom. That's when I tried to warn you. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been in my dad's tent, mere feet away from where I slept. I thought back to the covered figure I had seen when I woke up. I had assumed it was my dad, but it wasn't. It was someone, or something, else entirely. For the rest of the drive home, we sat in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of that covered figure from my mind. Who had been in our campsite, and why? We never found out. When we returned later that week, with a group of friends to retrieve our gear, everything was gone. There was no sign of our tents, our cooking supplies, nothing. It was as if we had never been there at all. Since that day, my dad and I have never gone camping again. We avoid the topic whenever it comes up, but the memory lingers, a dark shadow over what should have been a happy time. Even now, as I write this, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. It was a crisp morning when my friend Jack and I decided to take a hike through the old forest trail that led to the neighboring village. My loyal dog, Max, trotted along beside us. His leash, clipped but hanging loose from his collar. Max was a good dog, obedient and calm, except when he encountered something strange. The path wound through the forest, its vibrant fall foliage casting a kaleidoscope of colors on the ground. We walked in comfortable silence, the rustling leaves underfoot, and the occasional chirp of a bird, our only companions. The trail was wide and open, with towering trees on either side, their branches forming a natural archway above us. As we neared the end of the path, with the village just visible in the distance, Max suddenly perked up. His ears stood straight, and he let out a low growl. Before we could react, he bolted up a nearby hill, leash trailing behind him. "Max, come back," I shouted, but he was already halfway up the hill, his gaze fixed intently on something at the top. I squinted against the sunlight and saw a man standing there, still and silent. "Hey, buddy. Is that someone you know?" Jack asked, shading his eyes with his hand. The figure was oddly stationary, almost like a statue. He seemed overdressed for the warm weather, wearing a long coat and possibly a hat. "Max, here, boy," I called again. This time, Max stopped, but he kept looking up the hill, whining softly. There was something off about the whole scene, an eerie stillness that sent a chill down my spine. When I looked up again, the man had vanished. The road was wide and open, with some scattered trees, but no dense cover where he could have hidden. Jack and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Did you see where he went?" I asked. Jack shook his head. "No, but he was standing right there. How could he just disappear?" We cautiously climbed the hill, Max now at my side, his body tense and alert. At the spot where the man had been, there was no sign of him. Instead, we found a black decorative cross planted in the ground. It was old and weathered, with no inscription or markings. "This is weird," Jack muttered, looking around. "There's no path, no place for him to go." "Maybe he was a hunter," I suggested, though the words sounded hollow. The figure had seemed unusually tall and looming, almost inhuman. Jack thought he had seen the man dressed in black, but I was convinced he wore dark green, like a hunter's outfit. As we descended the hill, a strong scent suddenly filled the air, sharp and acrid, like an electrical short. Max whimpered and pressed against my leg, his tail tucked between his legs. "Do you smell that?" Jack asked, wrinkling his nose. "Yeah, it's like something's burning." The smell grew stronger, and a sense of dread settled over us. Max began to panic, tugging at his leash and barking frantically. "Let's get out of here," I said, and we hurried back down the trail, Max pulling us along. The scent faded as we moved, but the uneasy feeling lingered. When we finally reached the village, we stopped at a local restaurant to grab a bite and calm our nerves. The cozy, bustling atmosphere was a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the forest. "Hey, do you guys know anything about a black cross up on the hill?" Jack asked the waitress as she brought out drinks. She frowned, thinking. "Can't say I do. Never heard of any cross up there. You sure it wasn't just some marker or something?" "No, it was definitely a cross," I said, "and we saw this man, but he just disappeared. It was really strange." The waitress shrugged. "No ghost stories or legends I know of. Maybe it was just your imagination playing tricks on you." But it hadn't felt like a trick. Max's unusual reaction alone made the encounter significant. He was a calm dog, not prone to panic. As we left the restaurant, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the village. I glanced back towards the forest, half expecting to see the tall figure looming at the edge of the trees, but there was nothing there. The walk back was tense. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. Max stayed close, his ears flicking at every sound. The scent of burning had faded, but the memory of it lingered, along with the image of the man and the black cross. When we finally reached the safety of home, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Was it a ghost, a trick of the light, or something else entirely? The cross, the man's strange appearance, and Max's reaction all pointed to something supernatural. Days passed, and the experience haunted us. Every time I walked Max, I couldn't help but glance towards the hill, half expecting to see the figure again. But he was gone, leaving behind only questions and a lingering sense of unease. Sometimes, late at night, I thought I could smell that sharp, acrid scent again, and I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the image of the black cross, vivid in my mind. Whatever we had encountered that day was not of this world, and the fear it instilled in us remained, a dark shadow over our lives. Even now, I wonder if we'll ever know the truth about the Phantom of the Hills. And every time Max's ears perk up, every time he growls at something unseen, I can't help but remember that day, and the man who vanished into thin air.